Hello, my name is Peter Florence. Welcome to this special digital event for Festivaletteratura Mantova. It is my great pleasure to be welcoming one of the world's great storytellers, an actor, a writer, a thinker, a great communicator, Stephen Fry. He's here to celebrate the idea of mythology, specifically Greek mythology, which he has explored in 3 books, Mythos, Heroes, and now Troy. He's going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to do some questions, try and answer some of the things that have already been put to us by the Festivaletteratura audience, and also follow up on some of the ideas that he's going to propose. Stephen, thank you for joining us. Welcome to Mantova.
Thank you, Peter. It's wonderful to be asked, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I suppose I should begin by explaining why I have bothered to devote so many years of my life, of my fast disappearing life, to the subject of Greek mythology. I suppose in honor of the very kind and welcoming Italians who have invited me to this festival, I ought to say Greco-Roman mythology, but to be honest with you, I'm really dealing with the Greek origins, and I use Greek rather than Roman names for the heroes and gods nearly all the time. But how did I come to be interested in such a subject? Well, the fact is I've always been interested in it. You know how it is when you're a child. Certain things appeal to you and you can't get enough of them. I had friends at school for whom it was Second World War aeroplanes and, of course, football and all kinds of other things. And at a young age, you have a mind which is a very avaricious. It's very greedy. It collects information. And children are absolute devils for statistics and details and for knowing everything they can know about something. It seems to be a stage we go through. And I went through that stage, and I became just fascinated by Greek mythology and all the details of it, because it seemed to me to be so complete, like getting to know a family, or indeed for my friends who were mad about football, their knowledge of their team and the managers and their history seemed vaguely similar, but of course it had extra qualities too, as far as I was concerned. And I always felt it was a particular subject to me. You know, if you're watching a television quiz or something, and the quiz master says, and the next round is Greek mythology, I would always sit up and say, that's my subject. I felt it was just something that was particular to me. And then the years passed, and I never forgot it, because at university I studied English literature, and of course in the classical and romantic periods of poetry and drama, Greek mythology was a sort of an understood language of reference for all the artists and writers of that millennium, really, of the post-Renaissance time, and even earlier. Chaucer, the first English poet, wrote Troilus and Cressida stories and so on. So it was useful to have this knowledge, but I didn't think about it with any real depth or extra interest until a few years ago, when I was sitting with a group of friends, one of whom was a scientist, and we were talking about origin stories and how interesting it is around the world that different cultures have produced different myths to describe how the universe and life, and then, of course, humankind came to exist. And we discussed the Christian Hebraic, story of Genesis and so on. And other people threw up the stories of the Big Bang. And I started to talk about the Greek myth and the origins of chaos and Erebus and Gaia and Uranus. And they all stared at me and said, is that where the name Uranus comes from? And is that, how do you know this? And I said, well, I thought everybody knew it. And so I began, and I told the story literally around the table of the birth of the god Zeus, Jove, or Jupiter, as he's called to the Romans. And everybody stared at me with their mouths open, saying, why didn't I know this? They wondered why they were ignorant of it. And I said, well, I suppose everyone used to know it. in the Western tradition, but maybe it's just nobody bothers to teach it anymore, and maybe the books that describe it are a little old-fashioned. And as I got home, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to retell these stories for a new generation, if you like, for our generation? Wouldn't it be interesting to see? Because I realized that certainly in the English language, there weren't really any recent retellings of the stories. So I sat down and began to do it. I told the story of the beginning of everything, the creation of the cosmos, as the Greeks call it, of course, and the birth of the gods, and then the creation of humankind and the punishment of Prometheus, and then all those stories that the great Roman poet Ovid called the metamorphoses, the transformations, the favorite ones being obviously like how Narcissus turned into a flower, and Echo into a voice sounding from the caves, and the various other ones, you know, Hyacinthus and all these stories. And by the time I'd finished that was a whole book. And then I realized there was another book to be written about the age of heroes, Perseus and Jason and the Argonauts, and Hercules, as the Romans called him, and others, Theseus, of course, and Atalanta. And so that book became Heroes, and I've recently just finished the story of the Trojan War, and I will have the story of the coming home of Odysseus and Agamemnon and all the others. And it's been a fantastic adventure. And what has really thrilled me is the enthusiasm of people of all ages, both people of my own generation who've been happy to be reminded and have gaps filled in, because so many people obviously have heard of Hermes and Apollo and Arachne or Oedipus, but they might not remember the full stories. And almost all the stories of these names are just wonderful stories. So at a very simple level, they are marvelous narratives. They're the best stories I know, to be honest. They are prototype stories. They are stories that are behind all the stories we know. You know, it's a cliche to say there are only 10 stories or 8 stories or however many you think it might be. Obviously, there's the quest story, which is best, never been bettered in terms of the quest for the golden fleece of Jason and his Argonauts. And there are stories of coming home, what the Greeks called nostos, this journey home. The Odyssey is the exemplar of such stories. But one of the things that really interested me as I embarked on this adventure was how these stories speak to something utterly direct in human experience, so much so that they are beyond time. You'd probably be familiar with the idea that Richard Wagner, for example, when he wanted to create his complete work of art, his Gesamtkunstwerk, realized that he couldn't set his operas, his dramatic works in historical periods, because they became about that historical period. So if he set an opera in 15th century Germany, he did it with the Master Singers, of course, but with The Ring and Tristan, he set them in mythological worlds, because he realized mythological worlds are so universal that they speak to us now more than more recent works. If you write an opera set in the 1920s, as some composers did, Janacek or whatever, they're charming, but they're instantly dated. Whereas an opera that's set in a no man's time is universal, and the ideas behind them are universal. And I got a real sense of this when I was thinking about, actually, for Hay on Wye, the literary festival that Peter runs, and he asked if I might give a talk on technology, which is another subject that really interests me. And I realized an extraordinary parallel between the Greek origin story of mankind and our present day, that there's something so universally true about the story of Prometheus that it is eternally true, and it's true for us. And I'll try and explain that, because I think this is really fascinating. In the Greek myths, Prometheus was a titan and a friend of Zeus, and he helped Zeus create this new race of beings who were a bit like the gods, but smaller, and they were called the anthropoi, the humans, the men. They were originally all male. And Zeus loved them, as you know, they worshipped him, and they were like pets, really. They were like toys or pets. And he said to Prometheus, who had made them, shaped them with his own hands, that he could look after them and be their friend. But the one thing he was absolutely forbidden from doing was to give them fire. And Prometheus asked, why not? And Zeus said, if you give them fire, they can make themselves equal to us. And by fire, I think it really does mean, in the myth and in any interpretation of it, literal fire, the fire that roasts and toasts and melts and smelts, the fire with which they could forge weapons and, you know, create technologies and make themselves safe from animals and so on. But it also means the divine fire, that spark that we share with the idea of gods. Whichever culture you're from, we have always understood that while we are animals, from the earliest time we could talk, 50,000 years ago, we could see that we bred like animals, we defecated and ate and so on like animals, we died like animals, we had blood and guts like animals, but we also knew we were utterly different from all other animals, and that animals seemed to sense we were different too. And so naturally we tried to tell stories as to why this was. And the Greek story, and obviously we know the Genesis story about the apple or fruit that mankind took to make them aware of things. That's the fire, that awareness, that what we call today self-consciousness, that great philosophical mystery of consciousness itself, but awareness of consciousness, self-consciousness. And that is the divine fire that makes us so able to be like gods, to be above the idea of all material, so that we know about other animals in a way that other animals don't know about. That's to say, we can be pretty certain that an antelope doesn't know about an elephant. It probably knows what one looks like, but it has no curiosity about why an elephant is different, where an elephant comes from. And if you were to tell an antelope, or in some way make a shape to reveal a kangaroo, which it could never have seen, it would mean nothing to it. But humans are instantly curious and interested. We have this divine fire. I'm taking too long to tell the story. Zeus told Prometheus not to give us fire, both that real fire and that divine fire, that spark. But Prometheus saw that his creatures were very vulnerable, because clever and smart as humans might be, they had no defense against the stronger animals. They weren't as sharp and fast as the big cats or the wolves or the bears, and they couldn't run away as quickly as the antelopes and the deers or whatever, and they couldn't swim as well as fish. They couldn't fly like birds, and they, you know, in a sense, that we were just completely, as Shakespeare put it, poor bare-forked animals. We had no defense. And he could take it no longer, Prometheus, and he crept up to Olympus and he stole fire from heaven, from Olympus. He put it in a fennel stalk, Finocchio for some reason, and took it down and gave it to mankind. And in a short time, Zeus looked down and saw mankind had fire and was so angry, he punished Prometheus in the most appalling manner, chained him to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, and sent an eagle to tear and eat his liver in front of his eyes every day. And because Prometheus was a titan and immortal, the liver would grow back, and each day this torture would renew. And okay, so that's a story. It's interesting, and you can interpret it in different ways and say, well, I suppose the Greeks, unlike the Jewish people, rather than feeling ashamed and guilty at having eaten the apple and become self-conscious and to be able to discern and be taxonomical about the world and give things names and all the things that make us different from animals. Jewish tradition is to be ashamed of it and guilty, and to apologize for God, to be punished by God, and to be very sorry about it. The Greeks were saying, well, the gods were jealous, and they punished our champion Prometheus for daring to make us equal to the gods. And indeed, Zeus was right. Once mankind had fire, slowly over the generations, the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age, we slowly needed gods less and less, and Olympus, as it were, crumpled and fell down, and the historical Greek age, the classical Greek age began, which, although it had religion, it wasn't really anything like the lively, animated world of religion that the Greek mythological age gives us. So in that sense, Zeus was right. But fast forward to our time. Most people are aware, Elon Musk has made it very clear lately, but it's been on the cards and more urgently for many decades now, that the combination of technologies that is being enabled by all kinds of increases in processing power and computing and other such things, and in genomics, means that there is a confluence of technologies coming. Biotechnology, bioenhancement, bioaugmentation, what you might call bionics, gene editing, nanotechnology, new materials like Buckminster fullerene and graphene, robotics, and supremely, primus inter pares, as it were, is artificial intelligence, machine learning, unsupervised machine learning, the extraordinary strides being made in that field, and brain-machine interfacing like Elon Musk and his pig lately. Now, you can have two attitudes to this. You can be like Zeus and say, when these machines have reached a level, or are about to reach a level of consciousness, that's like giving them fire, awareness of themselves, awareness of their existence and of their right to exist. And if we do that, they won't need us, their creators, their gods, anymore. And there may be Prometheuses who make these mixtures of robotics and artificial intelligence who say, but we should give them that. They have the right to have their own intelligence reach a level of superintelligence of our kind. And we are faced with exactly the problem that Zeus faced. Can I afford to make these creatures self-aware and intelligent, and for their intelligence to replicate itself such that they won't need gods anymore? And we will face that, perhaps in my lifetime, but certainly in the lifetime of the generation below me. You've only got to read philosophers like Nick Bostrom and others to see that this age of what is known as superintelligence, this technological singularity, is very, very close. And when it comes, it will come at an exponential rate that is so huge that it will be beyond our control, really, to stop it. But we already are, some people are thinking, philosophers and others, about how we become like Zeus. We forbid anybody from stealing fire, from giving them this extra knowledge. And others will be champions like Prometheus. And of course, it may have happened before. It may have happened before and before and before, many times in many cycles. The universe is old enough for that to be the case. And that we, as the creators of these new forms of life, will be displaced, just as the Olympian gods are displaced. You go to Olympus now, and the stone thrones of the gods have rotted and corroded down, and the wind sweeps through, and there's no sign of the old gods at all, except in crumbling ruins. And there may be no sign of us too. So that myth may seem just to have been an old and ancient people trying to explain why human beings exist, but they put their finger on something absolutely vital to the nature of our survival as a species. This whole question of our consciousness and self-consciousness, and where it comes from, and whether it can be gifted to other creatures, creatures that we make as Prometheus is ourselves. It's no accident that the Prometheus myth was enormously important at exactly the time that our civilization in the West shook off the shackles and manacles of ecclesiasticism, that sort of world of church rule and authority and kingly authority through the church and through God. As printing expanded and, of course, learning generally, and a scientific revolution, the age of reason, gave way to the Enlightenment, as we call it. And at exactly that time, as the Enlightenment was blooming into the French Revolution and so on, and the rise of, what historians like to call Romanticism, it's no accident that the great heroes of Romanticism were obsessed with Prometheus. Beethoven in 1803, I think it was, wrote The Creatures of Prometheus. He was, as I'm sure you know, immensely influenced by the French Revolution and its promise for the freedom of mankind, as he thought, and the giving of intelligence and the supremacy of the individual that the revolution should allow, and the removal of tyranny, tyrannical gods of generals and aristocrats and kings. So he wrote The Creatures of Prometheus, and then within a very short time, Mary Shelley had written Frankenstein, which is subtitled, of course, The Modern Prometheus. And her husband, Shelley, the poet, wrote Prometheus Unbound, a dialogue between Zeus, Jupiter, and Prometheus as to why he was punished there. So all this is just one example of how Greek mythology has an amazing existence inside human thinking and behavior to this day. I've taken a long time, that was a good 20 minutes just to talk about Prometheus, but there are many other examples, I think, of how Joseph Campbell, who is someone a lot of people have contempt for, and I'm not quite sure what I think about him either. You probably know him as a mythographer, a man who wrote about myth a great deal, and some people think he's a bit too pat and so on, but he did, and it's very typical of him, find a very good phrase to describe myths. He called them public dreams. And I suppose you could call dreams private myths, but our public dreams is a good way of pointing it, because myths are not allegories. They are not absolute, you can't map a truth or a scientific or historical or cultural fact against a myth and say this means that, any more than you can with a dream. I mean, you can attempt it like a Freud or a Daniel or any other, a near-romantic figure who tries to interpret dreams. But I think we all understand that dreams are symbolic and that they can be interpreted in a symbolic way, much the way that art can be, or even a landscape can be. You can interpret a landscape in the way you can interpret a dream. And you interpret a myth in that way too. They are the dreams that publicly they're made. Jung called it the collective unconscious, which is another way of saying the same thing. And so I think myths will always be fantastically susceptible to modern ways of interpretation, and different generations will be able to look at something like the Prometheus myth and see an urgent reflection of their times, just as I do in this particular span of history. So I think that's really the thing that continues to excite me, and even as I move into a more historical realm of Greek myth, which is the Trojan War, where there are the archaeological data that can suggest the truth of it, as many people know, and the descriptions of Homer and so on are far more historical seeming, despite the presence of the gods, than, say, the earlier ones of Hesiod, his near contemporary, who talks about the birth of the gods and the metamorphoses and so on. So I don't know whether that's something that's worth talking about, whether there are questions directly arising from that, but I think my opening 20 minutes is probably up. So I will turn to Peter and see if he has any questions for me now. Oh, I can't hear you, Peter, for some reason.
That's all wonderful, Stephen. Thank you very much indeed. Can I just drill a little into this whole idea of how mythology embraces philosophy and specifically religion? You are widely celebrated as a heroic humanist and often quoted for your opinions about a Christian God. I'm intrigued by the way in which Zeus, as a capricious, rapacious, careless figure, might seem a terribly recognizable version of a deity.
You're absolutely right. And while I have been cast alongside some very notable atheists, that dread phrase, the new atheists, that Dan Dennett and our mutual friend Christopher Hitchens, dog rest his soul, and others have been connected with, I would say several things. Firstly, I always disagree with Christopher about the liturgy, which I find beautiful. I rather adore the Anglican liturgy in particular, which is the one I sort of willy-nilly grew up with at school and so on. I love the music, I love the versicles and responses, and I find them deeply appealing, as I do church architecture and much to do with the religion, the accepted and more or less orthodox religion, which ruled this land of Great Britain for so many years, and indeed Europe and elsewhere. But I just didn't happen to believe that the God that was being pushed existed. I think if Christians had talked about God as the Greeks talked about Zeus, I would have been very happy to agree, because my argument against the Christian God is what is known as theodicy, is the justification of this idea that he is presented as an ultimate good, as a benign presence who loves us completely. I just can't accept that is squares with what I see in the world. But if Christian said to me, yes, our God is capricious, mean, unfair, lustful, cruel, tyrannical, but also noble, beautiful, remarkable, wise, I would say yes, because the world is all those things. The world into which we were born is unstable, but it's also beautiful. It is unjust, but it's also noble. It is cruel, but it also has beauty, sacrifice, and heroism of a kind that makes one catch one's throat in joy, wonder, and admiration. It's full of these contradictions. And the only God I could accept as being behind it would also be full of those contradictions. The idea of having to accept a God who made a world in this manner, but actually is pure good, makes me say, well, it's the old argument from evil. Children with bone cancer. Come on. It just doesn't make sense. It's so simple. Why can't you just accept that, yes, all right, you have your God, but be upfront about what he's like? I mean, at least the Old Testament showed him as the brute that he must be. It's actually, I think, part of the problem is that so many people who profess to religion are actually not professing to any real theological doctrine that they deeply understand, but to a kind of ladybird book, pretty version of a magical thinking version of Christianity. And actually, I have more respect for true theologians than that. They use philosophical critical thinking, not magical thinking, to inspect and analyze their faith. So if you look at St. Augustine or Aquinas, or, and of course the later theologians, Bultmann and so on, and, the 19th century big hitters, they are very similar. In fact, a friend of mine who said to my father, who was a physicist, he said, physics is just a theology that makes machines work, which I thought was rather good. So, there is much interest in real theology and in real mystics and their thinking and the way they look at the world, because it's realistic. but it's the awfulness of evangelism and the hypocrisy and dishonesty of much of the Church of Rome in history, which really did know better, had intellectuals inside it who were smothered by doctrine. And I think it's the same in the world of politics. Doctrine and insistence on assertion without proof is a wickedness, whether it's in religion or in the secular world. And so it's really an objection to the same thing. It's an objection to the throttling of free thought and free inspection and lively, humorous inspection of the way the world is and the way it appears and the way we might hope it should be. It's only when assertion and orthodoxy and doctrine and dogmatism intrude on that I object. And in the same way with the culture wars now, I object on both sides. If I'm told that I must spit at a statue that I pass by because it's associated with some part of colonialism, I'll probably want to embrace it just because I'm ornery and contrarian. But if I'm told I should embrace it, I will want to spit on it. And that's just bloody-minded of me, perhaps, but it is, I think, a lifetime of being enraged by this fact that really we do all know better. We know that the answer to the world is to have an open, free mind that is allowed to range around all aspects of truth and reality without being throttled by orthodoxy and doctrine and what isn't appropriate or decent or right. So when I was growing up, I wanted to use 4-letter words and swear at tea parties just because the desire to shock was so strong, because you weren't allowed to use those words. Even to think them was evil. And now there's a whole new set of orthodoxies. And it's hard not to feel much the same mischief, really. So that's my issue with religion is, I can look at a Renaissance painting of a sleeping faun and Aphrodite or Hermes and be utterly charmed by it, or it can be Saint Sebastian and the Madonna and charmed by it. I don't believe in either anymore, but I believe in what each one represents, the motherhood, the tenderness, the potential tragedy that lies in a Madonna and child, a mother loving a child whom you know will grow old to die. And that's true of all mothers and children. So there's a pietà in every mother-child. So there's something eternal about a Madonna and child. You don't have to be an obedient, devout Catholic to see that, nor do you have to be a pagan to see the beauty of Hermes piping to Argos and sending him to sleep. The wonderful story of wit, of magic being outwitted by intelligence is the story of the Renaissance. It's Galileo outwitting the church, if you want to look at it like that. All these stories are there to remind one of certain, I think, eternal truths.
Can I pick up 2 questions that have come in that were emailed to me? One from Paolo, who asks a question about the way in which these myths are retold. We don't know much about Homer. We assume that Homer, like Euripides and Aeschylus and Sophocles, was writing in a tradition. How has the way in which these stories have come down to us freed you as a writer in the way that you retell them? And when you say you want to present them for a new generation, what does that mean?
That's a really good question. It's something that's so much easier to say than to explain. And Paolo is absolutely right about the nature of these sources of Greek myths. They go back a long way. And I suppose we have to remind ourselves that in the way we look at the past, there is history and there is prehistory. And just to remind ourselves, prehistory is taken to mean everything that took place in the human world before the invention of writing. And writing is very, very recent. It's only 5,000 years old. So anything before that, the only records we have are symbols, are buildings or images, archaeology we call it, that we can look at. Anything from 5,000 years roughly forwards, we have documents. Now, the stories of Greek myth, and you mentioned Homer there, are set in the Bronze Age, which is an age peculiarly, it's before writing, and yet there was a form of writing, but maddeningly, it's a form of writing we can't read, called Linear A, that was used in Mycenae and the places where Agamemnon came from, and the other figures who went off to fight the Trojan War. So we don't have any record of their time, except an archaeological record of artifacts and buildings and so on that have been discovered mostly in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So all we have is writing that comes from a later age. And the figure in the middle there, Homer, as you rightly say, well, he didn't write, at least so far as we can tell, he didn't write. He came from an age when writing had just come over from the Phoenicians to the Greek world and to the Anatolian, the world of Asia Minor, Anatolia, Turkey, as we call it now, obviously. Ionia, as the Greeks called it, was where we think Homer might have come from, which is the same landmass that Troy was on, rather than the Greek landmass. But we don't think he wrote. We think he used an oral tradition that told the stories, and that much of the nature of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the famous epithets, wine, dark sea, and so on, all those things, all the cow-eyed Hera, all these descriptions, these fillers, were to help the memory and to fill the lines, the flowing dactylic hexameters that gave the rhythm that allowed the memory of the rhapsode, as he was called, the bard, to tell these stories. But why we privilege Homer as being the greatest of them is simply a transmission down from his time to the Greek classical era. His name became very famous as the best of them all, and people learnt his poems, his epics, in the same way that imams and others learn the Quran. It's part of the sort of coming of age of a bard, a musician, a minstrel, a rhapsode. As they travelled around, it was quite a good profession, and they would always say there was this great one, Homer, and he told it best, and these are his lines. And they were eventually written down in the Greek classical age, the age of Euripides and Sophocles and Socrates and so on. And they worshipped him. I mean, I say worshipped him. They venerated him. They used his name a lot. They taught their children the stories. And his near contemporary Hesiod also wrote down stories about the Greek gods. And what happened over the period between Hesiod and Homer and the classical age is that they got systematized, that little irregularities were mostly rubbed out, but not entirely, so that you could have a whole family tree. And you can actually see these, they exist in books and online. You can see a family tree of the children of Ares, or the Oceanids, the children of Oceanus and Tethys, and these sea nymphs, and the parallel Nereids, and whose parents they were, and so on. And they go all the way down to Thetis, who of course was the mother of Achilles, and so is very important. And Achilles, did he exist? Well, who knows, except Alexander the Great, who we know existed, went to see his tomb, and he thought he existed. Indeed, he kind of based himself on him. And Alexander had, this is so beautiful, when Alexander went off to war as this boy, this very young man, his tutor, Aristotle, gave him a copy of the Iliad, which he had marked up himself. Imagine having a copy of that, Aristotle's Iliad, as taken by Alexander. So these stories definitely penetrated what we can call a full historical era. And Mark Antony went to the tomb of Ajax and took it and gave it as a gift to Cleopatra. So there is this exchange of the mythical age into the historical age. And it's very beguiling. It's very intriguing. They seem to believe it. And then for a long time, we stopped believing it. particularly during the religious era. I suppose it was just simply these were pagans, and we didn't even. There was such lies they told, such wickedness they were responsible for, that everything about them was their manuscripts were written over with proper, church illuminated scripts, and their statues were torn down. But as we know, as printing arrived in the middle of the 15th century, slowly Homer was translated into Italian and then into English. Chapman then famously translated it and inspired Keats and others. But still, no one believed it was true. They just thought it was great art. And it was really this German who became an American, Schliemann, who devoted himself to excavating Troy and Mycenae and discovering the so-called Mask of Agamemnon and the Helen's necklace and all these. I mean, it's absolute poppycock. His archaeology is now regarded as more it's often said that he managed to destroy Troy in a way that the Greeks never did. He used dynamite to do his excavations, but he established that there was historical truth to these later stories of a Trojan War that makes them very beguiling. But it allows me nonetheless to say that we don't know the historical facts. We only know that there is perhaps a historical grit that has made the pearl of the myth. And it means that I feel I can't be called up for getting something wrong, because I can say, hang on, it's a myth. So if someone says to me, you said that Epicrates is the niece of, or whatever, whereas in fact, if you look, she must be the cousin, I'll go, it's a myth. But one tries to get it right because it is so close to being a closed system. But in the retelling, I suppose what I try to do, I don't feel it's my job to totally to reimagine it. That's the job of a novelist. As it happens, we're living at a time when a generation of marvelous writers really are reimagining Greek myths, which I think is a different thing. So Marilyn Miller is an obvious example, the American writer who wrote the wonderful Song of Achilles and Circe, both of which have been enormous successes and are beautiful retellings of a very particular myth, the myth of Achilles and Patroclus, and the myth of Circe, the nymph who on the island of Aiaia. And Pat Barker, the wonderful British novelist who wrote The Silence of the Women, which retells the story of the great row between Achilles and Agamemnon from the point of view of the slave woman who is the casus belli, the proschema of the entire war or row between them. And various others, Natalie Haynes and other fine mythological writers are writing these stories, are reimagining them. But I don't think I have the skill of these wonderful novelists, but I'm more interested in trying to take the great tangle of coloured wools, and it really is an enormous tangle, and try and smooth it out so that someone can read my books and feel not that they've got the authoritative version, but that they have a version of a story like, say, Jason and the Golden Fleece or Theseus and the Minotaur, where they have just about all the pertinent facts and backgrounds to it, and they can then do a novelization of it like a Mary Renault or something if they want to. But what they've got is a clear telling that is not in old-fashioned language, but nor is it in trying to appeal to the kids in a sort of comic book style. I mean, those exist online and in publications. Obviously, they're done like comic novels or comic strips with drawings in frames and so on. And I'm sure that's a very good way to get children interested in the stories too, because there is, after all, such an overlap between these stories and the fiction that is selling, if you like, in the world today. I mean, you think of the four biggest franchises in the world, as far as I know, certainly in the Western world, are the Game of Thrones, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Harry Potter world, and the Tolkien world. They're all these fantasy worlds. They're different from Greek myth, and bizarrely, I'm not very interested in them. I don't know why. I've never been a particular fan of any of those things. I mean, I'm not absolutely anti them, and I wouldn't criticize anybody for liking them. Many people far smarter than me love them, but you can see how they owe so much to Greek myth. And it's obviously something that still speaks deeply to the young. And it's for other people to do, to try and parse that psychologically, to try and to analyze it, to see, is it something to do with the fractured nature of our world? Well, it's a bit like saying there's so much stress now. When hasn't there been a historical period when humans are under stress? But we can look at our world. It's social media. It's the pressures on the young, the depression indeed of the young, the self-harm, and maybe they are drawn towards heroic worlds of where human beings have autonomy and strength, but are fighting against clear-cut villains rather than complicated ones. And one can maybe dismiss it as being simplifying, that actually the fiction that the young ought to be reading is a fiction of complexity and nuance and ambiguity, which reflects the difficulty of their world, rather than one that suggests clean lines of good and bad. And that's a whole other argument about things. And but I do distinguish fantasy from myth, and I don't know why that should be. I mean, it's like I can see behind me my one of my Wagner shelves, and people are always puzzled that I don't really respond to Tolkien, which is about rings and dragons and heroes. And yet I love Wagner, whose ring cycle is also dragons and rings. And I can't quite explain why I see a world of difference between myth and fantasy.
Stephen, can I pull you back, because we've got five minutes?
Sorry, yes.
To Greece for a second. Chiara makes a beautiful point that for any young person who is interested about gender or sexuality, the classical Greek world that you portray is incredibly encouraging and friendly to many of the things that are now considered or have been previously considered challenging.
Absolutely right. And actually I let you into a guilty secret there. One of the things that appealed to me as a boy about Greek myth was that I found it sort of arousing, because it was so clear that the strict delineations and Victorian and theological regulations about behavior and gender and attraction didn't apply in this sunlit world of in which male beauty could be celebrated and male love and things that I was, as a growing boy, was aware that kind of stimulated me, and yet were so forbidden and dark in the world in which I was growing up. So that is true, and particularly gender, as you say. It's very interesting that that the statues of Hermaphroditus, who is this figure whose name lives on in the word hermaphrodite that is no longer used to describe intersex people, but there's a myth of this very beautiful boy called Hermaphroditus, because he was a son of Hermes, the messenger of the gods, Mercury, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, Venus. A nymph falls for him and tries to pull him into the water, and she eventually traps him into the water. He doesn't want anything to do with her, and she sort of wraps him around herself and cries out to the gods to let them be one. And the gods are in one of their very cheeky moods, so they know what she means. She means let us be a couple, but they take her literally and turn Hermaphroditus into this intersex being, whom the Greeks venerated. And there were many cults and statues and votary temples of Hermaphroditus, and the idea of this other being, this being who embraced both sexes, was very powerful. But the Romans, interestingly, and it's the Romans from whom we derive much of our religious censoriousness, the Romans didn't like him at all. They were a militaristic power, and they venerated masculinity, and they didn't like effeminacy, and they didn't like the suggestion of any blurring of the boundaries between the genders at all. So they destroyed a lot of the statues, and they forbade any mention of this particular deity as he became Hermaphroditus. So that's a very interesting point. I mean, naturally, if you're a girl reading Greek myths, you may say, oh, there are too many male heroes. But I think it's very interesting that really the most important writers on Greek myth in my lifetime have all been women, and earlier. I'd start with Mary Renault, and then Edith Hamilton, the great American mythographer, and the ones I mentioned. And also there's Emily Wilson, who the daughter of A.N. Wilson, the novelist, who's done a magnificent translation of the Odyssey. So clearly women are very drawn to this world as well. They see that women are well represented in power, and certainly if you study classical civilization or classics or whatever, however it's described in universities these days, you come across Euripides, for example, whose fabulous tragedies, most of them are from the point of view of women, the Trojan women, obviously, the Bacchae, Medea, Phaedra, these extraordinary tragedies in which the women are center stage and have both the power in terms of their poetry and their ability to express their condition, sometimes the real power, as in the case of Medea, choice to kill her children rather than be humiliated. Their very lack of power becomes the tragic motif of the play. This is very a modern way of looking at women that goes all the way back to one of the very first playwrights who ever existed. So I can imagine that it is a great window for the young to look in the Greek world and see there's a freedom of association of ideas and gender and roles that is a breath of fresh air. No question. Thank you for that. For raising that point.
And Stephen, one very last question. Given that we are coming from Mantova, which was the home of Virgil,
yes.
How are you with Aeneas?
Well, there's a word that usually goes in front of him, as you probably know, which is pious. Pious Aeneas, sanctimonious Aeneas, holy Aeneas. I think we can separate the Aeneas of mythology, and mostly Virgil, he arrives through, of course, from the need of the Roman Empire to have a founder hero. And not just the Roman Empire, incidentally, he visits France and Britain as well. And supposedly Brutus, who's descended from Aeneas, gave his name to Britain, and not the Brutus of Shakespeare, but another one. So there's, a very self-conscious modeling on the part of the early Roman poets and religious figures, the pontifex and so on, and the other roles within the Roman religion, to create a myth that connected Rome to the Greek civilization, but gave it its own special quality. Virgil was the son of Aphrodite, Venus. He's a Trojan, but in a sense that makes him of the Greek world. And his whole history, therefore, everything that he brings with him, the palladium he brings from Athena, the holy relic from the center of Troy that he manages to rescue at the beginning of the Aeneid, and he uses it as the foundational stone for the Rome that is to be on the banks of the Tiber. So it connects the two civilizations in the Roman imagination and allows them to believe that they come from this original place of civilization, much as we look at Jerusalem as the wellspring of the Abrahamic religions, which it is, obviously the Jewish and the Christian and the Islamic religions all centered there. Similarly, this idea that the Greek islands and mainland and the Trojan peninsula as well were part of everything: civilization, gods, writing, history, generalship, all the qualities that the Romans then made special to themselves. So it was very important for them to be a part of that, but to be separate as well. And I suppose, you can clearly read the Aeneas as being an almost religious text for Romans, and that's how one used to study it at school. You couldn't criticize him. And he was a bit of a bore, frankly, for us, because he's friend Anchises and the holiness of it all, and always being, so observant of the gods, and he seemed a bit colorless when compared to Theseus or Perseus or any of the, or certainly Achilles and Ajax and Odysseus, the great Greek heroes. But I think maybe if I'm inspired to, when I've finished telling the story of Odysseus and Agamemnon after the Trojan War, which is my next book, maybe I might look at the Aeneid again and see if I want to retell that.
Stephen, thank you so much. To everybody who's been watching this, absolute joy of a conversation or a lecture or a brilliant laying out of these ideas. Stephen is as good on paper as he is in the word. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy these books. Enjoy this festival. Thank you.
Thank you. All the best. Thanks very much.